Well, yesterday we had reached the point where the war had broken out in Europe, and the September 1939 between Britain and France on the one hand and Germany on the other. Italy joined the war on Germany's side later. And because the Viceroy on 3rd of October declared that India was also at war without consulting any Indian opinion. So on that basis, at least on that excuse, all the Congress ministries in the provinces resigned. Uh, I have previously said that one of the reasons for the resignation was some dissatisfaction with the work of the Congress ministries within the Congress itself, which had exhibited itself in the re-election of Subhash Bose uh, against Sitaramaiah, the candidate from Gandhiji's own family. Now that the Congress was out of office, its position on the war was equivocal. Technically, it supported Britain in the war. It said it favored the war against fascism. Nevertheless, it opposed the curtailment of civil liberties and other war regulations. And ultimately, from October 1940, it launched the individual satyagraha, which was quite extensive. 20,000 went to prison in that satyagraha. Communists joined also. They were about 3,000 in number out of these 20. At the same time, Subhash Chandra Bose fled from India. It was not clear what his intentions were, and it has not yet been clear whether he wanted to go to Russia, Soviet Union, or whether he wanted to go to Germany, or whether he believed that Soviet Union and Germany were in alliance. Whatever be his perceptions, he left India and went through the Soviet Union to Germany. Thereafter, he then went to Japan and joined the Indian National Army, of which he became commander, 3rd Field Company. But that flight also considerably disconcerted Congress ranks. And it was in this situation that the Muslim League began to gain strength. And it had one difficulty up till 1940, that apart from asking for greater Muslim representation, it had neither wholly supported Indian independence, nor had it put forward any program, social and economic, of what it will do if it ever shared power. And that difficulty had already come when, in 1937, when Zamindars insisted that the League should oppose any tenancy legislation or any tenant or any pro-peasant legislation which is being looked at. It was more or less to overcome this that Jinnah then ultimately favored what came to be known as the Lahore Revolution, December 1940. Although the name Pakistan was not used, and although it was not said that there would be one separate Muslim nation, the Lahore Resolution talked about independent states or regions where Muslims are in the majority. Within India, the word Pakistan was not used. Pakistan was invented in 1930s by Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, who was in Cambridge, who gave all sorts of names to Indian, to Muslims, prospective Muslim states in India, Pakistan for Punjab, frontier, Kashmir, and Sindh and Balochistan, and Bangla Islamistan for Bengal and Assam, and Mughalistan for Kerala, and Osmania for the whole Hyderabad state. Almost when you looked at his map, everything was green except few areas which were left for the majority Hindus. Almost every area was turned green in his map. So he was laughed at, and in Lahore resolution, therefore, the word Pakistan or even one Muslim nation was not used. But apart from that, the Muslim League did not yet put forward any plan of what they will do in this independent state. Only the only promise they made, which was never fulfilled, was that they will not ask for Muslims anything more than what, in India, anything more than what they already would grant to non-Muslim minorities in Muslim states. This was an important promise made there, that Muslims in the other parts of India should be treated in the same way as non-Muslims are treated in the Muslim states, not yet named as Pakistan. You can see that if this promise came about, then Muslims in India would hardly have any rights left, because such is the dreadful position of non-Muslims in Pakistan today. So that was never fulfilled, and in fact, Muslim League never talked seriously about how it will treat minorities in Pakistan. When he did say that, then Jinnah said that Muslims, Hindus, and Christians would all be equal in Pakistan. But again, you see how in practice this has turned out. In any case, from then on, Jinnah took the name, began to use the name Pakistan, and then began to talk about as if Lahore Revolution had only spoken of one country. And this slogan caught on. It's like not. It's obvious that it caught on, although people like Iqbal himself in 1930s had derided this, although he was supposed to be the first proponent in 1930. But he, in his letters, he derided this slogan of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. At that time, he was already dead when the Lahore Revolution took place. And obviously, the largest parts of India would be left out of Pakistan. Even in the 5 provinces involved, Punjab, Sindh, Northwest Frontier, Bengal and Assam, Muslims formed barely 53 to 55% of the population, a bare majority. If anything else was added, then they would lose their majority. You know, if Western UP was added, or if, as they said, corridor was added, then the Muslims would lose their majority in Pakistan. There would be a Hindu majority, so obviously Muslims couldn't ask for a corridor or anything of that sort connecting Bengal with Punjab. But very few people thought about it. In fact, in the 1946 elections, Muslims, even in Madras presidency, voted in a large majority for Pakistan, for Muslim League, which had called for the slogan Pakistan in its electoral manifesto. So there is no doubt that between 1940 and 46, Muslim League gained enormous support among Muslims. Partly this was based on the basis of religious ideology. The slogan was Muslim hai to Deen, religious slogans do count. There was then the fact that within the Congress, the proportion of Muslims was quite small. Maybe after the Khilafat movement that had continuously declined. So whatever the Congress might say in resolution, there in composition, the Muslim proportion of membership was very small. except Northwest Frontier Province. So by 1945, uh, the Muslim League was recognized as an important political party, and already in 1944, when Gandhiji had been released, he had begun negotiating. So that's one side of the situation. The second side, mainly of what was happening in the national movement, uh, while the individual satyagraha was taking place, the war suddenly began to change its complexion. In June 1941, Germany attacked Russia. In December 1941, Japan attacked America and Britain and began to seize their colonies in Southeast Asia, besides their offensive against China. And therefore, the complexion of war changed from a mere war between Germany and England, France, in which France had been defeated and subjugated by Germany, to a world war, in which the Soviet Union and China were deeply involved, and India would also be threatened by Japan. By February, Japanese troops had reached, February 42, Japanese troops had reached the Indian frontier at Assam. In this changed situation, there were obviously there were two views. One view, which Nehru in his discovery of India states, and which you can see in his writings and statements of that time. A view also adopted with some hesitation by communists by January 1942, that now was the time to suspend active opposition to the British government and assist independently the Allies in the war, because the complexion of war had changed. As not only Nehru but Gandhiji said that if China and Russia are defeated, then humanity will take a big step back. In private conversations, he also said that if Japanese come to India, they should be resisted. But actually, by February, they were on the Assam front. They had even gone parallel. So this was one opinion. The second opinion was increasingly that of Gandhiji and his immediate follower, Sardar Patel, others, in which was said that now was the time, tactically now was the time to oppose the British government, because the British government is in a dire straits. This would be willing for a compromise. What they were previously promising after the war, to happen after the war, would come about now. So, joining the war effort should come at a high price to the British government. The price should be demanded for our joining the war effort, and that price should be some settlement. Ultimately, this was to lead to the Quit India Resolution. These two opinions became very clear when the British government announced the Cripps mission. Sir Stafford Cripps was a Labour MP, now a minister in the cabinet, and he was sent to India by Churchill and Emery for one motive on paper and another private. The motive on paper was to appear to negotiate with the Congress and Indian politicians, and the secret or the implied uh, motive was not to give any concessions, but to show that you are negotiating so that Americans would be satisfied. Americans indeed sent a representative, Colonel Johnson, to expedite the talks. As the talks proceeded, the concessions that the Indians wanted, as put forward by Nehru, were that Indians would enter the executive council. He will not demand that the defense should be totally given over to Indians, but the executive council should function as a cabinet responsible to the prime minister. They were agreeing to Muslim League representation in the cabinet, but they said this would be a cabinet. Whatever Muslim League wants, we will concede for this cabinet, but it should be work as a cabinet. The Indian representatives should not be individual representatives. Now, this was such a small point that Cripps thought this should be conceded, but he was overruled by Churchill and the Cripps mission failed. And its failure actually put Pandit Nehru in a very awkward position, because now there was nothing. The British government was not offering anything. And what he intended was probably that the Congress would continue its ordinary organization, small agitations, some kind of war supportive effort of its own for China and Russia. But Gandhiji had other ideas. By summer, Hitler had recovered from his defeat before Moscow in Russia and had launched a huge offensive in which he was actually nearing the heart of Russia, nearing the great city of Stalingrad, and his armies were besieging Leningrad. And so many people thought that Germany would be successful in the war. Japan had been eminently successful. It had occupied Burma, and it had defeated American troops in Philippines, occupying Philippines. So Gandhiji confessed that although he was greatly depressed about it, he said Germany, Italy and Japan would probably win the war. And therefore that particular tactical, what they thought was a tactical moment, now was the time to make major demands. And ultimately, they got the majority in the working committee, and Gandhiji asked Nehru to resign if he did not support this position. Siraja Gopalachari and Golabhai Desai in fact resigned. And then AICC met on 8th of August and they passed the Quit India resolution. Although in the speeches, Azad, who had up till now opposed the Quit India resolution, but he was the president of the Indian National Congress, he and Nehru and even Gandhi said no program of agitation would begin immediately. This is our position. We want the Britain to quit India, the British to quit India, while we would support the Allied effort, war effort. So war effort was to be supported by the English were to ask to leave India. That was the major demand of the Quit India resolution. But it is wrong to say that any armed uprising was fought off, as the British government claimed, or any immediate satyagraha or civil disobedience was even fought. All was left in the air. But this was perhaps a mistake. Everything should have been made clear in the Quit India resolution, because British government exploited this silence, and on 9th of August they arrested all the Congress leaders. And these arrests, as had been the case in the civil disobedience movement, then went to the districts. They didn't wait for any civil disobedience to take place in the districts. They immediately arrested the leaders, as took place in Aligarh and other districts also. Throughout India, 9th and 10th and 11th August, people were arrested. Their presses were closed, their offices were sealed, and their uh, organizations practically declared illegal. Now there was response to it, but that was usually unorganized response, sometimes armed response, as in Azamgarh and parts of Bihar, in which many people died. There were also some terror attacks organized by underground socialists, but they were all suppressed. Now the result of Quit India movement is very hard to judge. People would have different opinions, but it had two results. First of all, those who were already supporting Congress became even firmer. Others who were not supporting Congress looked at the Quit India movement as a brave movement, and who fell here in it as martyrs, and those who suffered, they were just imprisoned for nothing as victims of oppression. And therefore, when in 1944 Gandhiji was released, and particularly early 1945 when the Congress leaders were also released as the war was racing towards its end, then you could see in the celebrations in the country that Congress had gained immensely in the popular prestige in areas, in those sections of the population where it was already popular, whether Northwest Frontier Province or in the rest of India. But as far as the majority of Muslims were concerned outside NTO and Northwest Frontier Province, these 2.5 years more were fatal for the Congress, because it left the entire field entirely to Muslim League. Whatever they said, the Congress could not reply to it. And it had almost no organizations left among the Muslims, because its Muslim leaders were also put into prison. Therefore, politically, the loss among Muslims was immense, owing to this total absence of Muslim leadership of the Congress. Now the situation when the war had ended in 1945 was that almost everyone believed that independence had to come. Partly through the Quit India resolution, partly through the way the war had gone. The Soviet armies had liberated Berlin. There was immense prestige of the Soviet Union. And America too was committed under Roosevelt to freedom of nations. And here I think an anecdote or an episode of which I was witness as a child might be of some interest. Perry Anderson, in a recent book, Indian Ideology, has quoted some obscure civil servant who could only have been talking to Nehru after 47, by saying that Nehru believed that independence would not come by 1975, would not come before 1975. He was not optimistic. In other words, Nehru was only interested in some compromise with the British government. But this is totally false, and I'll tell you from this anecdote, which after Crook's mission, Nehru began to tour, as was the board, as their wont, addressing meetings and looking after Congress organization. And this brought him to Aligarh. And one afternoon, as children we were playing, my elder brother and I, the afternoon. I think it must have been late April. So we suddenly found the Tonga coming in, and of course Jawaharlal Nehru, who could fail to recognize him, getting down out of it with two or three other Congress workers and stalking into our house and shouting for my father, saying, Habib, Habib, get me an omelette. So it turned out that either the Congress workers had not offered him food, they forgot about it, or they offered food that he could not eat. So he thought that he said, take me to Habib's house. My father was his junior when he was as a member of the council in UP. He was a lieutenant of Motilal Nehru, my father, and therefore Pandit Nehru was his senior. So he called him Habib. And as my father came down, my father and sat as the omelette was being prepared. My father told him that he was very sorry the Cripps mission failed. Uh, After all, Congress should have agreed to it because we would at least have become Dominion after the war. And we were outside the door of the drawing room. You know, if Pandit Nehru comes to your house, you always are very curious what's happening. And Nehru turned to my father and said, Habib, you will always remain a professor. We will be free in 5 years, whatever happens. So it turned out that not in 5 years, but 5.5 years. But such was the optimism. So certainly the optimism was coming true as the war ended in 1945. Everywhere, whether in Burma or in Indonesia or in Vietnam, there were revolts against colonialism. And it was thought that colonial rule must now go. And therefore it became important for Congress leadership to talk to the Muslim League. There was Gandhi Jinnah talks in 1944, then there was the 45 Shimla conference. Earlier than that, there was the Bola Bhai Desai Liaquat Ali formula, in which Congress agreed, despite the fact that it had 57 members in the Central Assembly in the 1946 elections still to come, whereas the Muslim League had only 30, but they agreed in advance that they would have a parity, the Congress League parity government in the center. Not to be just for the moment, but practically permanent. But of course, they didn't mean Pakistan. And this formula was rejected by Jinnah and the British government on the ground that the parity could be Hindu-Muslim parity, not Congress League parity, which meant that Congress would have to recognize itself only as a Hindu organization. So this failed. The Shimla conference under Wavell failed, took place. And in the meantime, and then the elections took place, the 46 elections, in which what was expected happened. As I say, Muslim League got 30 seats in the Central Assembly to 57 obtained by the Congress. The Muslim League fared badly in the Northwest Frontier province and not entirely satisfactorily in the Punjab, where the Unionist ministry continued by a coalition with Congress and the Sikh parties. But it fared very well in Bengal and Sindh, and it fared very well in all the non-Pakistan provinces, that is to say Muslims in large majorities voted for the Congress. But it is also important to remember that even in the Central Assembly, where the voting rights were restricted to 1% of the population, Congress got 14% of the Muslim votes. And in Aligarh, which was considered to be elite strongholds, Voltage got one-fifth of the vote. Still to lose deposits, but still one-fifth of the vote. So it is not that Congress didn't have Muslim support, but obviously it was first in the poorer elements, very poor elements, weavers and so forth, um, backward caste Muslims, and the middle class almost entirely voted for the Muslims. 46 elections made uh, took place again in a situation of national upsurge on the one hand and communal divide, increasing communal divide on the other. Um, First, there were the INA trials. Subhas Bose had gone to Japan in 1943. He had reorganized the Indian National Army that had been organized before, but now he reorganized it. There were important contributions made by the INA to Indian national freedom movement. Uh, for instance, uh, as was the case with the Congress in its resolution, Subhas Bose, whose own language was Bengali, made Hindustani in Nagari and Urdu scripts as the language of the INA. He made Iqbal's song Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara as the national army song, so that it has still become the army song. He did not use Vande Mataram, which was far better known than Jana Gana Mana, and made Jana Mana the national anthem, which has still continued. He made all these concessions in his appointments, and among his soldiers, Muslims were quite prominent. This was another important gain of the INA, that despite Muslim League propaganda in India, within the INA had total loyalty of Muslims outside India, whether in Malaya or in Burma, where there were large Indian Muslim minorities. They heavily funded and supported INA, and also Muslim soldiers, as turned out in the INA trials. Jai Hind was also a slogan that he coined. So certainly he showed much wisdom in the ideological and institutional framework he gave to INA. He also said that when INA liberated India, he would hand it over to Gandhiji to run as he liked. He disclaimed any personal ambitions. So when the Congress and other political organizations in India were denouncing Subhas Bose and INA for going over to the Japanese. But once Japanese were defeated, INA soldiers became heroes to everyone. This was a turn of opinion. It was a natural turn of opinion when they were arrested and they were brought to trial in the Red Fort. Then Nehru, Bholabhai Desai, even Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru, such a moderate politician, they joined their defense committee. Muslim League also joined in the defense, although separately, to one Muslim officer, Abdul Rashid. And one of the demands then became that INA should be released off. When actually punishments of the INA officers were announced, there were riots and protests, notably in Calcutta and Bombay. And many people died there, they were shot down. This had hardly ended when on 18th February the Royal Indian Navy revolted, RINU. First in Bombay, and then it spread to all the ports in India, involving 78 ships and 20,000 ratings. Again, as ratings fought off the British troops in Bombay dockyard, there was rioting in Bombay, which Indian police would not suppress, and therefore British troops were involved, British regiments were involved, and by official count, 226 were killed in Bombay, protesting against and for supporting RI. Therefore, the Irian mutiny, which was only called off by the ratings on appeals by Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, and Jinnah, on 22nd February, when they said they were surrendering to India, not to Britain. So this was one very major event in Indian history. After Singapore mutiny, the biggest mutiny in the world, Indian mutiny ever. Other movements also took place. There was the Bengal Tibhaga movement of peasants and the Telangana peasant uprising in Nizam's dominions, which began in 1946 and lasted till 1951. Quit Kashmir movement in the summer of 1946 was another important event, and suddenly Sheikh Abdullah and Afzal Bey became almost national heroes in India. But alongside these events, which involved Hindus and Muslims together, there now began the communal divide. It began with the riots in Calcutta, then they spread to Noakhali in October. They had begun in Calcutta in September, August. Then they spread to Noakhali, Bihar. There was an incident at Garmukteshwar, is what Muslims at Garmukteshwar in UP, but strongly suppressed by the UP government at that time. And then Punjab in 1947, from around March 47, which did not actually stop and shaded into and developed into the great mass slaughter which began in August 1947 on both sides of the war. This communal tension actually put the national upsurge in the shade, and while it was true that after RIN mutiny and then the certain railway strike and postal strike which actually took place in the summer and was only called off at the appeal of national leaders, the British government could no longer govern India. And the coming into power of the Labour government in the July elections, in which they had said in their manifesto that they would give independence to India, it became clear that India would have to be made independent. But how? There was first the cabinet mission plan, in May 1946, after 3 months of negotiations. The cabinet mission proposed a united India with a three-tier situation. Something which you may be surprised, Sikandar Hayat Khan, who had moved the Lahore resolution, had imagined a three-tier situation. A weak federal government, then three groups of states, A, B, and C. A and C to be just Muslim majority states and B to be Hindu majority states, and then the provincial governments. It was thought that the Congress wouldn't agree, but the Congress agreed. And pending the coming into existence of the plan, an interim government was formed. The Muslim League first refused to join, but from October 1946 it joined the interim government, in which Jawaharlal Nehru was the vice president. And when the Muslim League joined in October, he was Liaquat Ali Khan was finance minister, Patel was home minister. But it was very difficult to work this government, although it did continue formally, but it was extremely difficult to run it. Liaquat Ali Khan drafted the budget almost without any reference to Jawaharlal Nehru or any other colleague. And it became very difficult to say how a budget could be defended in which the cabinet had not been consulted, whatever its merits. So it was difficult to work it. Then the agreement on the cabinet plan broke down because the cabinet plan had envisaged a constituent assembly which would make a constitution in conformity with the cabinet plan. And elections to constituent assembly have taken place from these provinces. Provincial assemblies had elected representatives, and princes were also allowed who joined the league to send their representatives. But before August 47, very few princes affiliated to the constitution. In any case, the difference came over a theoretical question. Jawaharlal Nehru said that Constituent Assembly, where it had the necessary agreement of all parties, could change the cabinet mission plan. And on this statement, Muslim League withdrew its agreement to the cabinet mission plan. And probably, now everything, people are saying that this was because Jinnah wanted a single state of which he would be Governor General or head of state. Because, of course, Nehru's statement did not necessarily change the situation on the ground when you had accepted the cabinet mission plan. But that meant that the cabinet mission plan had to be replaced. In effect, what the Muslim League said was that they wanted partition, which was, in fact, what their electoral manifesto had declared. So, ultimately, it led to Mountbatten Declaration of 3rd of June 1947, which you knew what would happen then. Provincial assemblies of all provinces were to declare whether they would join India or Pakistan. In the case of NWFP and Sylhet district, because it was clear that the end of NWFP assembly would say we are joining India, so there a referendum would have to be held, not of all people, but of the 10% electorate, provincial electorate, and so also in Sylhet district. And then there would be a boundary commission to define the boundaries. This was the Mountbatten decision. It's actually misleading to say who accepted the Mountbatten decision or not, because this decision was not for acceptance by anyone. It would be what the British would pass through an act of Parliament, which was the India Independence Act 1947. And if the parties wish to join it, for instance, if the Congress wished to accept it, then they could form the government on their basis of majority. If they did not, then Mountbatten would hand it over to any civil servants, Indian civil servants, and the country. So obviously, those who say that it should not have been accepted or not, it was not the case. This was not for their acceptance or rejection. This was a declaration. The only courtesy that had been shown was that Mountbatten shared the contents of the declaration before making it public, with both Congress and Muslim League interests. And this ultimately led to the partition and to all the problems of partition there, the migration of 6 million Muslims from erstwhile East Punjab, which was Punjab, Indian Punjab and Haryana, and 4.5 million non-Muslims driven out of Pakistan. And of course, slaughter, which would go into any figure from about 100,000 to 150. The only thing you could say, one thing which needs to be said, is that although the partition was made on religious grounds, this was true only for Pakistan. It was not largely true for India. Despite the fact that Indian constitution, Indian law made measured certain specific provisions for Hindu and Sikh migrants from Pakistan into India for their citizenship. But otherwise, all important Congress leaders said that that India, the rump India, that is the remaining part in India, would remain a secular state. Whether it was Nehru, of course, who had always talked in terms of secular state, or Patel, who in a famous letter to G.D. Birla said that if he had been told that an independent India would be a Hindu India, he would not have sacrificed a minute for its sake or gone to prison. He went to prison for a free India, which is the India of all. So this was the sentiment, and I think even to Sardar Patel, much tribute should go towards standing up for it. Jinnah had said, I think perhaps Lahore resolution in mind, that once Pakistan has been created, now it is a state where Muslims, Hindus, and Christians, and presumably Sikhs, would all be treated equally. They could have all their forms of worship as they like, and so on and so forth. But in fact, secularism was washed out in Pakistan, and NWFP ministry was dismissed, and the leaders were arrested, and the almost persecution of non-Muslims started there. I will not take further time. Technically, we should come up to the stoppage of the slaughter, which Gandhiji and his fast and assassination had a great role to play. We know all about it, I hope. We know that his fast was about two factors: 55 crores to be paid to Pakistan, and the return of Muslim refugees to their houses in Delhi, and the guarantee by RSS and Mahasabha leaders, individually named, to cease attacking Muslims. When this fast began in 13th and was only abandoned on the 18th, when by practically pressure of mobs, the Mahasabha and RSS leaders were forced to give those undertakings. And on 30th January, he was assassinated. So that rounds off perhaps the history of our freedom struggle. Our father of the nation died because of, he never used the word secular, but whatever he said in effect was for secular. Now this completes my third lecture, and I must now very quickly go over to the historiography of the national movement. I am afraid I cannot deal with it as I would like to. I think I've forgotten the synopsis. Do you have to do synopsis? Um, you see, I will quickly go over the various kinds of historical writing on the national movement. First, let us look at the contemporary writings as the national movement proceeded. What did its leaders think of themselves? What did the moderates, Dadabhai Naoroji, Ramesh Chandra Dev, Justice Ranade, Gokhale, think of the national movement? First of all, they thought it as a movement of the middle class, educated middle class. It didn't mean that the movement was above the interests of the middle classes to them. Certainly, those interests were important, the interests of mill owners, the interests of those people who had been educated and were denied employment, were discriminated against by the British. They were not allowed to sit in civil service examinations in India, they had to go to England to sit for it, and so on and so forth. These were interests. But essentially, they thought that being the educated middle class, it alone had the knowledge and the leisure to look after the interests of the poorer, of their poorer brethren. Here was the basic difference. You know, when you suddenly say that Indian National Congress was a middle class organization, you must remember that they wouldn't have minded this designation. They would have taken pride in it. But then they would have said that it's the duty of the educated middle class to look after the interests of their poorer brethren, the peasants and others, to reform their social life, to prevent them heavy taxation taking place, to prevent food grains from being exported out of India so that they could have cheaper food grains and in famine they could survive. So this is what the duty of the educated middle class is, and that is what the national movement is. Secondly, they thought that their ideology was, the ideology of this middle class, its approach was to be modern, modern principles of equity, not democracy necessarily, but representation, higher Indian representation in decision-making bodies, social reform so that women's rights are protected. Education, modern education should be as extensive as possible. These are the things to fight for. And so in their life, national movement was not yet a freedom movement, but a movement for constitutional reform by middle classes, so that the interests of all the poorer people, principally, but also their own interests, would be protected. A second view, which you will not find very much in writing, but much more in popular belief, particularly spread through Gandhiji himself, was the ideas of national movement, about national movement, found in Hind Swaraj in Gujarati in 1909. In Hind Swaraj, he first shows how India is made poor by Britain, in which he draws heavily on the writings of the nationalist school, Ramesh Chandra Dev and Dadabhai Naoroji. But suddenly at one point, he turns. The questioner is saying that then there should be constitutional reform, we should have something like a parliament, legislature in which Indians would be there. And Gandhi then turns around and says, then you would have In England, in India, you would have Indians as black Englishmen. Indians should go back to their past. And he then thought that in India's past there was equity and tolerance. He forgot all about caste system, religious bigotry, and so on and so forth. He talked of past India as village India, without industries, all handiworks and handicrafts, and therefore a kind of revivalist India. A revivalist not in the actual sense of reviving what existed, but an idealistic India which had never existed, although he imagined that it had been in existence. In some form or the other, this persisted. Even now, this persists. We say about India that it has always been tolerant, it had always multiplicity, it had always given freedom of thought, when we know in our heart of hearts that this is not true. So, a kind of idealization of India's past. For instance, he talks easily of India of Rajas and Pashas, advised by Pandits and Mullahs, as if all the time there had been no communalism, no interreligious bigotry. And he is able to say, despite all that India as a nation has nothing to do with religion. That again is a misreading of the past. Religion was so heavy all the time in our traditions, past traditions. So a past idealization, totally different from the actual past. Was there. This kind of view of the national movement had its influences in such writings as Pattabhiti Taramayya's History of the Indian National Congress, which was written at that time, as if one of the businesses or aims of the Indian national movement is to revive India's glorious past. All this was rejected in Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography. It was published in 1936, and in fact also rejected in his earlier book, Glimpses of World History, or Letters written to Indira Gandhi, published in 1934. He argued that the national movement was about independence, as Gandhiji had said, whether you call it Swaraj or independence, but it was for modern values. And he therefore on this point was one with the moderates. He in fact regarded moderates as great intellectual revolutionaries. The difference was that where moderates were even moderate in looking to modern forms, constitutional reform, not full democracy, self-government, not independence, joint rule with British, not totally separate. Jawaharlal took the total position, modern values in total, nation, national independence, democracy, equality, welfare state, everything. Nehru was to somewhat modify this vision in his discovery of India, where he begins to talk about the religious contribution of religion. Incidentally, this is an interesting part. Everyone who is a thinker and thought of the country and not of his own afterlife begins to think whether religion has been good for mankind. And a man like Abul Kalam Azad, a theologian of great importance, in 1907-9, the actual date of the writing is not, said that the question is valid whether religion has done anything useful in practical life for humanity. It's another thing whether religion is right or wrong and so on. So forget it. Ask whether it has done anything right for humanity. And his answer was no. That's not the test of religion. Religion doesn't seem to have improved mankind. So that's a totally business, other business. And this was what Nehru, in his glimpses and autobiography, argued more strongly than others. But in Discovery of India, he concedes that religion has done something good and improved morality. And he was even prepared to believe in the theory of transmigration of souls, that somehow God is removed from it. So Nehru modified somewhat his views, but on basic issues of modern values, on secularism, he remained firm. The fourth important trend, it became more important in late 30s and 40s than earlier, was the Marxist view. And you will find it basically in Rajanikanth's India Today, two editions, one of 1940, which was destroyed by German bombing, and 1946, which had two chapters added. It agreed, it said that it was a genuine national movement, not like Perry Anderson, who denies that it was a genuine national movement at all. He said it was a genuine national movement, which needed to be supported by everyone. But in actual fact, its weakness was that it was led by the bourgeoisie. I needn't spell it out because it's spelled out, the word is spelled out in this capitalist class and their ideological supporters. And so again and again forced into compromise with imperialism and local feudal and capitalist interests. This is the argument of the book. The book I would strongly advise you to consult. India Today. In the 46th edition, he also had a chapter on problems of democracy in which he argued against the ideology, the idea of Marxism. He has very harsh words to say about Gandhiji. Nevertheless, this is an important book, particularly because it underlines the way India was exploited and the way Indian national movement developed. He is extremely, of course, sympathetic to that. It has since then been the starting point, I would not say determining element, but starting point for Marxist studies of the national movement, later Marxist studies for the national, with which I shall come later. Now, simultaneously, they have developed the British colonial view, and these views are of two types. One is critical, heavily critical, rather denunciative. It was a self-serving agitation by the middle classes, which had been created by Britain and by education, English education. They had no real claim to represent anyone. They did not know even India. India was known to British officials who were everywhere, all over, who moved all over India in districts and villages. India was known to them. And therefore, this was a kind of artificial movement confined to a very small minority, as I said, deference and microscopic minority, and that continued to be used. India was not a nation, so it could not be called a national movement. This was the position of the Simon Commission, which always put national in inverted commas. And so, actually this view continued to prevail until the 1937 elections. Until then, almost the British government's official position was that ordinary Indian, the poor Indian, supports the British government, and if he was asked to vote, he would vote for the British government or its supporters. But that turned out to be a disaster in the 1937 elections, when with only 10% electorate, the Congress obtained such a large majority. The second British view, which you can call liberal, the first you would call conservative, was that the national movement was a creation of British rule itself, not as you would think to oppose it, but as a natural result of British rule. Modern ideas have been planted here, as Macaulay wished, and once planted, they would, of course, germinate wishes for or desires for representation, desires for social reform, desires for further more scientific education, desires for civil rights. This was all natural, and Britain, therefore, a policy followed from it. Britain should compromise with it. Britain should give concessions to it. It's summed up in the title of Thomson and Garrett's book, Rise and Fulfillment of British Rule in India. It is the same Thomson who was the father of the famous historian Thomson, to whom Iqbal wrote that, my declaration that there should be a separate nation of Muslims in India was merely an exaggeration. I was not serious about it. And it's all what Chaudhry Rahmat Ali said is it's all a joke. 1935. So these letters have been printed. So this is that Thomson. So Thomson was friends to Indian leaders and intellectuals. And this was the liberal argument that gradually India would advance to dominionhood. They didn't conceive of independent dominion with full rights, because they would then be actually like Englishmen, accepting color. They would have the same kinds of institutions, the same kinds of knowledge, and the same kinds of attitudes. The third element was, once the national movement became so large that it could not be dismissed as a microscopic minority. This is what you would find in the Simon Commission's report. It had now become not a middle class movement, but an upper caste movement. Upper caste Hindus. Clothing itself in a national garb, which was clear, which was fraudulent, because India was not a nation. It has more than 400 languages. As R.P. Dutt pointed out, some languages were spoken only by 2 or 3 persons. And one person, he said, died in the meantime, and so reduced the force of argument of British imperialism by his untimely act. He died, and there was no person left. One language. Although he also added that a language spoken only by one person and not understood by anyone else was a new cherry added to the knowledge of languages. But the real thing was that all of these languages were in Burma. So the separation of Burma by Act of 1935 deprived British imperialism of this particular argument, because something like 300 languages were then given out of India to Burma. However, these were the various arguments. And if it was an upper caste movement, of course, policy decisions followed from it. You then separate the scheduled castes, and you, of course, separate Muslims, and then you will have a very small Congress like that. But basically, in the Simon Commission, argument was the assumption that India was not a nation, it could not be a nation. because of its multiplicity of languages, multiplicity of cultures, traditions, and so on. And so the national movement was not really a national movement at all. Then there were the communal interpretations, which developed at the same time. Um, it particularly was developed in circles around the Hindu Mahasabha, and notably from the time of the partition of Bengal. Because the partition not only encouraged Muslim communalism, it also encouraged Hindu communalism. It argued that the Indian national movement, as represented by the Congress, was rejecting the Hindu past and giving concessions to Muslims. The most scholarly argument for this view is presented by R.C. Majumdar in his edited volume, Struggle for Freedom, and the History of Freedom Movement in 3 volumes. R.C. Majumdar. Although they are post-47, they represent fairly well the point of view which was held by Hindu communal historians in 1940s. R.C. Majumdar is a very important historian, very serious historian. He has to be taken with. He is not one of the present breed of historians, very accurate as to his facts, and but his opinions are different. He could wax enthusiastic, be extremely enthusiastic about the beauty and plan of the Taj Mahal and of the ability of Shah Jahan. And yet at the same time he writes that after all Hinduism flourishes where there are Brahmins and temples, and if Muslims take away lands from Brahmins and destroy temples, then where is Hinduism? So he has both these elements, and that is why he is a serious historian. On the Muslim side, the serious historian at that time was Ishtaq Hussain Qureshi. He was in administration of the Delhi Sultanate. He was professor at Delhi University, later on became Minister of Refugees, for refugees in the Pakistani government. He said that there was a Muslim freedom movement. He edited 3 volumes of that, seeking liberation from both British rule and Hindu domination. Now the difficulty about this view is that there was no Hindu domination under British, there was only British domination. So how you could fight Hindu domination when it did not exist, when it was under British rule? So what Ishtaq Hussain Qureshi does is that he takes the struggle against the British also as a part of the as the Muslim freedom movement. So people who even didn't know about Pakistan and who would not even dream of who could not think of a nation, let alone a Muslim nation, are brought into this, like Tipu Sultan, the 1857 mutineers and so on. But you see, the question is, what about 20s and 30s and 40s? You see, fighting British before the national movement is one thing. Now what about 20s, 30s and 40s? There was an interesting article in Dawn, which from Karachi, which was published in Journal of History of Pakistan, and that is how I saw it, in which the writer said that there is a psychological problem in Pakistan, and the psychological problem is that our national movement was not against our rulers. There are no heroes and martyrs against the British in our Pakistan movement. Our movement was peculiar in the world because it was against fellow subjects. No present grievances against the fellow subjects, but all about the future. And that is our difficulty. He could have added that one of your difficulties is that in Urdu poetry, there is no patriotic verse for Pakistan before 1947. Even in Iqbal, you see, even in Sara Jahan Hamara, Hindustan Hamara. See, the native place is the whole world, not Pakistan. So even in that poem, it might sound nice to a Muslim in England, but that the whole world is our native place, is our country, but there is no particular glorification of the nation, Muslim nation. So this is one of the difficulties in this particular interpretation. Because the Muslim League throughout, as we have seen, its demands were not from the British, what the British should give us. The demand was what the Hindus should give us in future, how much seats they would concede to us. Thus, the attempt to link the Muslim League movement with earlier Muslim participation in patriotic struggles, like 1857. You can't write 1857 without Bakht Khan or the Rani of Jhansi. I mean, both have to be there. If you only write about Bakht Khan, then how do you explain that he was so anti-Wahhabi and threw out Wahhabis from the Jama Masjid and forbade cow slaughter? So you have these difficulties when you go back to, when you try to trace, to make heroes out of those who really fought against the British. Because fighting against the British, they had to ally with everyone. If they were Hindus, they had to ally with Muslims. If they were Muslims, they had to ally with Hindus. Post-independence interpretations. True Ishaq Hussain Qureshi, like R.C. Majumdar volumes, are in 50, I'm treating them as practically pre-independence. Post-independence, the nationalist school, which I call the mainstream nationalist school, is far more sophisticated than Hubert, much more sophisticated than Sitaram Ayya and other ones. They combine two things. If you read the history of freedom movement in India, which is perhaps the only official history of the freedom movement in 4 volumes, edited by Tara Chand. Remember, the author is the same who has written Influence of Islam on Indian Culture, New Persian, and some of Aristotle. He traces the national movement from 2 roots. The composite elements of our culture, mind you, not the entire, he doesn't argue that the entire culture was composite, but there were composite elements in our culture which brought Hindus and Muslims together. And then this composite culture became the basis for the unity of notably Hindus and Muslims and other communities in their opposition to British rule. Because they suffered under Britain, therefore they unite. Therefore he studies very carefully the ideological trends among both Hindus and Muslims. Shah Waliullah is there and Raja Ram Mohan Roy is there. All these trends are there. And he studies them and how, what are the separating and what are the composite elements in their thought. And then he argues that the social reform movement, as I had said in lecture 1, I was borrowing other people's ideas, how social reform brought new classes into consciousness, women, lower caste, outcaste, ultimately in one. And that united in one movement which represented all classes of people, in which he placed Gandhi's traditional ideology as well as Jawaharlal's modernist ideologies has been developed. Now it's a persuasive argument. Of course, there are flaws in it. The fact that it is very difficult to combine Jawaharlal's thought with Gandhiji's thought, although Gandhiji made him his successor. Um, and this difficulty is seen there. For instance, Tarachand is very critical of Gandhiji's role in the second roundtable conference. Amazingly critical. The second is from the British side, the second important, and that is the Cambridge School. Um, in order to understand the Cambridge School, must go back to the historical approach of Sir Lewis Namier, who had nothing to do with India. But Lewis Namier argued that large proclamations, great principles, are often enunciated, often, not always, often enunciated by people or persons who have their own personal interests served by them. And this was particularly the case in British Parliament. You have a particular nephew to find employment in India, so you are asking for reorganization of the East India Company. For that reorganization, you want to have justification. So you will say that the East India Company is full of cruelties, how it has ill-treated the native Indians. There must be some reform in the East India Company. When Pitt's India Act comes in, and then you are on the board of control, then you get your nephew or your younger son fitted in the East India Company service. So this is the kind of thing which was very true of 18th century England. And Lewis Namier therefore had a cult of private documents. Don't go by public declarations. Combine them with private documents. How much did he gain from them? Now, although he did not say it, and several Namierists do not do so, this actually reduced the importance of large economic and social processes. This is the basis. Although Namier was Oxford, this is the basis for the Cambridge School of Indian History. The opening shot was fired by ANC's Emergence of Indian Nationalism, which came out in 1958. Then there is Judith Brown, Gandhi, and civil disobedience, and their cooperation, non-cooperation, and Aisha Jalal's book on the sole spokesman, Muhammad Ali. What is common to all these is the emphasis on individuals. For instance, I just noted Seal's treatment of Dadabhai Naoroji. What is said about Dadabhai Naoroji has nothing to do as to what he wrote. Nothing. It is said that he wanted to live in London, therefore he wanted to get money from Bombay to say that he was representing Indian interests in London, and that was what made him write on behalf of the Congress. Nothing as to what he wrote about. Nothing why Bombay mill owners or Bombay lawyers should fund a man in London who is writing against the British government, who is not writing in support of the lawyers or the mill owners. He is not even supporting them on the India's industrial labor question. Why on earth should they support Dadabhai Naoroji in London? They forget that they support him for what he is writing. And they don't expect him to write about themselves. They have many other people who will write about them in Bombay. They want him to write about India and the poverty of India. And that's why they send him money. So this kind of ideological sphere they don't understand. And that is why if you read the whole book, Emergence of Nationalism, you have nothing about what Dadabhai Naoroji was writing about, what Ramesh Chandra Dutt was writing about, only their personal interests. This is also there, and these personal interests, because they can hardly say, about Dadabhai Naoroji, you could say on the basis just of speculation that he preferred London to Bombay. But what about Gandhi? What about him? He didn't live in a princely manner at all. On the other hand, he tried to live as far as he could like a peasant. So what about him? So the caste is brought in. He was a Banya, and therefore all his followers were his subcontractors. This is the word, the other word he uses, farmer. Farmer in English means also contractor. They were either his farmers in non-cooperation or subcontractors in civil disobedience. So the caste factor, although actually few of them were Banyas, there was no particular caste composition in Gandhi's followers, uh, or even communal composition. So this is this kind of personal uh, personalization, and therefore um, insistence that not ideals but caste or personal factors or religious community factors only operated. This is the main notion in the Cambridge School. This you can see in also Aisha Jalal's Sole Spokesman, where there is an analysis of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. You see, it's important, of course, to see what motivated Jinnah from time to time. It's also interesting what how other people were motivated. I told you one anecdote about Pandit Nehru. I'll tell you another about Ali Khushama, one of the big leaders of the national movement. Fortunately or unfortunately, my uncle also, the elder cousin of my father. He came to stay with us in around 1946, where the whole university was full of followers of Muslim League, dominated by them. But one good thing was there that Kirat was not so popular as now. Muslim Leaguers were not thoroughly. Only in the court and the union's annual meeting was Kirat resolved. Anyway, so we are far more eager than they were. To their meeting in Sketchy Hall, where my father went, I also went, although I couldn't fully understand his oratory. He was a very good English speaker. He talked of Pakistan and what Muslims would be like, almost everyone is Sultan there, and so on and so forth. When he returned, my father asked him, because he was the elder brother, why did you say all this? That we know Aligarh is not going to go into Pakistan, so what's the use of telling them they will be sultans when they will not be in Pakistan? So he said, Habib, you don't understand, because, like Nehru, he didn't say, Professor, you are out of the picture. Pakistan is a bargaining counter. The position is that Hindus just don't tolerate the British. Not we. We can tolerate British. Hindus don't tolerate British. The implication is that Hindus don't tolerate British. They will give us every possible concession so that India is free. And Habib, do you know what will happen then? Muslims, except in words, will be citizens, and Hindus, except in words, will be subjects. They will be our subjects. So, it's true that he then went to, after showing fealty to India, he suddenly went off to Pakistan, became Secretary General of the Muslim League there and all that. But, this is the notion. You can argue, of course, that he was in pathways to Pakistan. He says that I alone of the Muslim League leaders was strict on Pakistan, but how strict he was, I was a listener to that. That was strictness. Obviously, Aligarh could not be under any theory inside Pakistan. In any case, um, so the Cambridge School, by looking at these individual interests, I'm sure Khalifuzzama did not have at that time a thought that he would ever leave Lucknow. And so miscalculations occur. But by looking at these personal, because they want to analyze whole movements, that of course is a gross error. They are important, these things. Jinnah's personal ambitions were important, but they could not have left to Pakistan in the way Aisha Jagal has. The subaltern group takes off from the Cambridge School by accepting practically wholesale its criticism of the national movement's leadership and attributes all the successes of the national movement to subaltern groups, which is its own name for people who are not educated in the English system. They are not Western influenced. You must be clear about that. So a zamindar who has not passed high school is a subaltern, but a rich peasant who has, or a peasant who has passed intermediate is not a subaltern. He belongs to the elite. So education is the when you come to definitions as given by Ranjit Guha in his introductory essay in subaltern studies, education, forming one's ideology, is the essential element, not your economic position. So zamindars may be subalterns, while educated peasants in the national movement might form an elite. Now to them, or at least to Ranjit Guha, the nationalist elites and the colonial elites, that is to say the imperial power, were at par. They are no different. And actually, what moves history is the action of the subaltern classes who are violent, who are surprisingly egalitarian, because in our past we were all hierarchical in the caste system and so on, which is a lower caste or any tribes are at it. So, but they assumed that they were egalitarian. So there's a lot of idealization of the subaltern, which is actually not proved by ethnography or by actual experience. And therefore, they condemn the national movement. They now, Partha Gupta even rejects the idea that India is a nation. And a recent studies, Perry Anderson, in his Indian ideology, takes up both the ideas of the Cambridge School and the subalterns. I classed him in the Cambridge School, but he actually was both these. Then he condemns the national movement. He says that they didn't do anything, and the Indian independence came because of the. Here he agrees with the Cambridge School because of the 1937 elections, where they had to go to the Indian National Congress, had to go to the people, and because of the Japanese invasions. Otherwise, India would have still remained under British rule. So there is both in the subalterns and in the Cambridge School there is a depreciation of the national movement, which they share, both of them share, and which you can particularly see brought together in Perry Anderson's subalternism. Finally, there are Marxist interpretations. I have given the list of the major writings. Basically, there is a difference of assessing the national movement. Was it a coalition of classes? All classes except the landlords, basically bourgeoisie, workers, peasants, Was it a coalition of that led by the bourgeoisie? In the sense that they themselves, Gandhi was himself not a millionaire, but in the sense that they would tolerate um, property, protect property, and as far as possible protect private capital, and as far as possible some amount of landlordism. Or was it a divided movement in which while one side represented the bourgeoisie and was prone to compromise with British imperialism, there was another side which represented the working class and the peasantry. This is particularly the notion of T.M.S. Namboodiripad in History of India's Freedom Struggle. But this is difficult to sustain because actually the Congress remained the backbone of the national movement in 1947. And it is very hard to say that other movements like revolutionaries or communists or socialists ever mattered so much. They mattered certainly, but there was no comparison with the Congress. So just to dismiss the Congress as a bourgeois component of the national movement is not very historical. I think Sumit Sarkar makes a more objective assessment in a modern India, although he is already a little affected by subalterns, so perhaps he gives much more weight to tribal uprisings or protests than is warranted. Well, thank you very much for your kindness in attending these lectures. One always feels very happy when one is heard. Thank you.